Welcome to Conversations, Lehman College's series of discussions with major theater figures of our time. For the second of a two-part chat, our guest today is a legendary general manager and producer of Broadway, off-Broadway, and off-Broadway, my old friend and colleague, Albert Poland. Welcome to Conversations, Albert.
Hi.
Welcome again.
Thank you.
In our last conversation, you mentioned there were 4 seminal theater events of your career so far, and you mentioned one of them. What was the other 3?
Well, actually, they weren't theater events. They were, what I meant was life-changing events.
Life-changing events.
Right. The first event was seeing Judy Garland in A Star is Born. The next one was the advent of AIDS.
Right.
The next one was going to rehab and getting sober, which I've remained for 18 years.
Very good.
And the last one was 9/11, of course.
Right.
Yes. And I, by the way, happened to be on Sheridan Square, and I saw the buildings go down. I'll never forget it. It was very moving, and still is.
I watched it from my office window. I watched both of the attacks on the World Trade Center from my office window and was very deeply affected.
Yes.
9/11 has evoked a lot of has evoked much theater since that time. Have you seen anything that you consider important in the theater having to do with 9/11?
No, not really. What could possibly match the experience, of it? I thought that the documentary that Michael Moore made had some very powerful moments in it regarding it. I cried when I saw people's papers blowing through the air.
Right.
On Sheridan Square, I just saw things sparkling in the sun, and I thought, what is that? I didn't know what it was, and it was the sun hitting people's papers,
We go way back. And the other night I saw a revival of Why Hannah Skirts Won't Stay Down by Tom Ian at La Mama ETC. And I know you saw the same theater. I did the seminal off-Broadway theater from the Cafe Chino, La Mama, Judson Church. You produced Sam Shepard, you produced Tom Ian in a big way. You were partly responsible for bringing us out here in the world. What do you think has happened with that kind of theater?
Well, I think that you and Tom Ian are examples of people who were part of the birth of the off-Broadway movement, which was a great theater movement. It was unique, it was new, it gave voice to people who wouldn't have found a voice in the commercial theater. It introduced a poor theater in a way. In other words, producing on a budget of $10, which I think makes people use their imaginations, and which I find very thrilling. And you and Tom, in my mind, went through that process in that theater and then went into the marketplace. You honed your skills and then took them to the marketplace, which I think is the ideal use of what that had to offer. There are others who have simply remained there, and to me they have not grown, But Tom's first commercial success was The Dirtiest Show in Town, which I general managed, and Bruce Mailman, our friend, produced with Ellen Stewart. And I remember the night before the first performance, Bruce saying to me, I think that we should put folding chairs in the aisle and sell them as standing room. I said, that is just offensive to do that, So the next night we had the first performance. There was a waiting list of 40 people. The lobby was packed. I ran up to Bruce's apartment, which was above the theater. He said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I want the dinette set." and we lined up the dinette set and sold them. And then one night we had a complaint. A man said, I bought an aisle seat and there's somebody sitting in a chair next to me. And I took him into the lobby and I said, the only thing I can do is give you a refund. And he said, it's a fire hazard. And I said, oh no, there's 3 feet of clearance. That's the required clearance by the fire department and so on. And he said to me, I got something bigger than the fire department. And I thought, I think this is the mob. And his wife grabbed his coat and said, Lou. So the next night, and this is the honest truth, we did not sell the chairs because I suspected something might happen. About 10 minutes into the show, there were sirens outside. Firemen arrived in raincoats with axes. The chief marched in. He threw open the doors to the theater and saw absolutely nothing because we didn't sell the chairs. Okay? He turned to me and said, I want no smoking signs in this lobby. And the next night, we, of course, resumed selling the chairs.
Among your many plays in this voluminous resume that I read is something that I didn't know you did. Wait Until Dark, starring Marissa Tomei and Quentin Tarantino. Now, what on earth was that like?
It was not great art. I turned down Hedwig and the Angry Inch, which was like, would have taken me back to what I love most about Off-Broadway,
right,
because I had committed to doing Wait Until Dark. Okay. My attraction...
Yeah, Hedwig and the Angry Inch sounds like a Poland show.
Well, I loved it. I was very attracted to the fact that Quentin was going to be starring in this.
Kill Bill Quentin Tarantino.
Yeah, because he was at the peak of his heat, and I just thought, wow, you know, this is somebody who I'd like to know and work with, you know. It was a funny production, we could say that, but it didn't last very long.
Another of your accomplishments is the production of Futz, directed by the hair director, Tom O'Horgan, a mutual friend of ours, and another mutual friend, the writer, Rochelle Owens. Not many of our people in our audience would know what Futz was about, but let us say it involved a man having sexual relations with a pig.
Yes, it did.
And it caused, in the early, when was it? The
1967.
1967, there weren't too many plays about men having sexual relations with a pig.
The way I came into Futz was very typical. The general manager called me, Paul Bukowski, who was a fine general manager, and he said, I have a play here at the Theatre de Lys. Tom O'Horgan is directing it, and hair was the hottest thing on Broadway. They are short $10,000. Do you think you can raise it? And I said, count me in, you know, because Tom O'Horgan, you know, La Mama Troupe. I'd never seen it, didn't read it. I called, you know, my string of investors, and they arrived on English bikes waving checks. I had the $10 in 3 hours.
10,000.
Okay. Yeah, whatever it was. That night, I went to the dress rehearsal. And here were these country people licking each other, crawling over each other, making strange noises, having sex with their farm animals. I ran out of the theater screaming, and if Paul had been around, there would have been a murder. But as my friend Bruce Mailman said, after it opened, Albert said it was a poem. And, you know, it was a time when everyone was arriving at the theater saying, I'm so stoned, you know. And I saw it a few times stoned, and it changed my head. I grew to just, I thought it was great. But it took about 8 times seeing it. Really, it was very multi-layered. It was a new kind of theater. And I really could never go back quite to the conventional kind of theater again. It did literally, you know, change my head.
As I told you, I saw Rochelle the other night.
Right.
And she has not changed at all. It was fascinating to see her, and as brilliant as ever, and a very serious poet. And she wrote this remarkable, wild play, and no one could be less wild personally than the poet Rochelle Owens. In a monogamous...
Do you mean Rochelle Owens, the poet?
That's who I mean. You described in our last conversation some of the high points of your career, and you described a rather difficult situation with Quentin Tarantino in Waiting for Dark. Can you tell us some of the low moments of your career?
Well, I did a play that came in from Los Angeles called Greek.
We haven't heard much of Greek.
And it had been a success in Los Angeles.
That can be...
And John Simon wrote in his review, "There are two things that bode ill for success in New York. Success in Los Angeles and whiteface. This play has both." And there were lines in it like, "Your eyes are like turds in a punch bowl." You know, the producer would stand in the back and say, "Oh, the language, the language." So that was one. Another one was another play by Rochelle called Istanbul, which was at the Actors Playhouse. In fact, both of these were at the Actors Playhouse. You know, and it was quite doomed. And the reviews were the run you out of town on a rail, you know, variety.
How did you happen to stumble into that production?
Well, I wanted to work with Rochelle.
No, the Greek.
Oh, Greek? Somebody asked me, the producer asked me to fly to LA and see it and see if I wanted to do it. And, you know, I learned a lesson, because something can get a standing ovation in LA and be hated in New York.
Right.
You know, because I just thought a standing ovation would be universal, you know. I did another play called...
They stand for everything in LA.
It's true. I did another play called Crimes Against Nature by the Gay Men's Theater Collective that came from San Francisco. That got a huge response out there.
Right.
You know, and it came here and just died a very, I thought, cruel death, you know. As Arthur Bell wrote in The Voice, this play is one thing, but getting across town is hard enough.
What are some of the other low points of your career? I find this interesting.
Well, there was one producer who worked strictly in cash, and everything was paid in cash, you know, and I just did not question. You know, I did not want to be charged with knowing wherever this cash was coming from, because my part of the bargain was perfectly legitimate, you know. And he would create a family, but then he would run out of cash, and it would become a dysfunctional family. You know, everybody tearing at each other. And he was later put behind bars. What he was doing was lending drug dealers money, and they paid him back with interest. I couldn't understand why they would need money, but, you know, that's what he was doing. So, you know, working with him was, I did it twice, and it was not a pleasure, really. I mean, he was a well-intended person, but quite dysfunctional, you know.
But what about the art? No, I'm kidding. Where do you think the theater is going right now in New York?
Well, I think the theater, sadly, is lacking in creative, you know, writing and directing talent. And so you see this, you know, one revival after another. I mean, I've been very, very pleased and honored to have done Long Day's Journey and Glengarry, but I want to do new work, because I think the only lasting thing that we can give is the literature.
Right.
You know, we're not a movie. You're not going to be able to buy a video of it and have it in your home, you know. So it's kind of, you know...
To what do you attribute that, the fact that we're doing revivals?
I think that we're not living in a time that is conducive to creativity. I don't think that we're living in a nurturing world, particularly. I think the world is very, very difficult. I also think that producing theater has become so expensive that people aren't willing to take risks, and writers have to make a living, and they deserve to make a fine living. So they're making their living in motion pictures and television. You know, a writer, as far as I know, can get $150,000 for doing a screenplay that is never even produced.
Right.
You know, whereas an option, you know, for 1 year of a writer's life for a Broadway play is probably $10,000. Well, you know, what are you going to choose? You know. And that's made scheduling very difficult because writers and directors and designers are making their living elsewhere. So if you want them for the theater, you have to synchronize their schedules, and you end up working with assistants, which is more costly, you know. I mean, I wish something would happen that would just, I wish we would have, this is terrible, but I wish in a way we would have a depression that would take everything back to a more realistic financial footing. Because I think when money dictates, creativity suffers, you know. And I think there are 3 phases of things in the United States. There's the birth of something where it's, you know, just this incredible, you know, quivering, you know, thing. Then it begins to develop, and the exploiters come in and they exploit it, which doesn't necessarily hurt it. It brings it to a larger audience. And then it ends with the bankers.
Right.
You know, it ends with the banks. That is what's happened to Hollywood. You know, it's what's happened to the theater. We have the corporations, you know. And to me, everything in this country winds up in Las Vegas. You know, I always think of Elvis as a great metaphor. You know, this just earth-shaking, monumental artist entertaining, you know, ending up drunk and bloated on a stage in Las Vegas. You know.
I've lived in past years in both Los Angeles and for periods in Chicago, both towns with tremendous theater audiences. And I noticed, especially in Chicago, there was a whole theater culture of its own having nothing to do with New York, or very little to do with New York, feeding New York. And I saw some immensely creative productions in Chicago. Is it possible that the off Broadway of today is in Chicago?
Yeah,
or Los Angeles, or in...
I think that's very possible. Well, Los Angeles, you know, has what we call waiver theater. It's 99-seat theaters.
Right.
Which really, there's hundreds of them.
Hundreds.
And because everything is so spread out in L.A., you know, you can drive a few blocks and see theater. You know, whereas if a big production comes, it's in one place, and I think the waiver theater has hurt, you know, the success of larger touring productions that come in there. As for Chicago, I think Chicago has an energy all its own, you know, which I think is great. You know, I've worked with Steppenwolf and Goodman and productions that came into New York.
Every bit as professional as stuff you get in New York.
The Grapes of Wrath came from Steppenwolf.
Right. Frank Galati's gorgeous.
And Orphans, you know, which Gary Sinise, people know him as an actor. He's a brilliant director. Brilliant.
Right.
And
I first saw him in the revival of Bomb and Gilead. It was it was staggering stuff. This was stuff that originally played in New York, then played in Chicago, came back to New York, swept New York. So I'm wondering if young theater talent, if New York has become so expensive, perhaps young theater people interested in theater should go elsewhere and create theater in Birmingham, Alabama, for all I know.
I don't think so.
Is it happening that
There's
way?
a theater on Lafayette and Bleecker.
Right.
45 Lafayette. I think it's called the Culture Project or something. They're doing wonderful political activist theater. You know, they did that play about you know, against the death penalty. I can't remember the name. What is it? Exonerated. Yes, the Exonerated. They did that. I just saw something there written by Warren Leight.
Right.
About his experience working at a school in China, you know, and it was just something that you wouldn't see, you know, and it had social and political implications.
So there are vital projects in New York.
And you know, in the audience, I felt like I was in the '60s in the audience. I was sitting there with people who were passionate about what they were seeing, and I loved that, you know.
So something is happening in New York, you feel?
Yeah, there's a seed.
Right. Yeah. What about musicals? Is there anything happening in musicals in New York? I know it's become next to impossible to produce a musical in New York. Not
I've-
impossible, but next
I've
to
only
impossible.
done one, which I picked a good one, you know, The Boy from Oz, and I'm working on some in the future. I find them monumentally just awesome undertakings. They are huge. The Boy from Oz took 5 years to produce. I signed my contract in 1998. It went on in September of 2003. You know, so again, why would musical people want to spend 5 years of their lives for something that can be closed in one night? You know, when they could do television or film, you know, or just music. You know, it makes it a difficult choice. You know?
Right.
But if you have a hairspray or something like that, you know, you can make a killing. You know.
If you would you have any suggestions? We're at Lehman College here with aspiring actors, writers, directors. Do you have any suggestions for them?
I think that, you know, we're all in this milieu because we have a passion. And I think it's really crucial that you keep plugged into your passion at all times. And if something is hurting it or stifling it, get rid of it. Just stay with what is stirring your passion, because having a passion is one of the privileges that we have, and I think I think it needs to be honored, and, you know, cultivated and nurtured, and I believe, because, you know, I didn't start out with a blank check. I believe that if you do fine work, and if you have a good time, and if you're honest, you won't fail. I really do believe that, and that's kind of been my philosophy in my career, because, you know, I started by producing a road company of the Fantastics for colleges when I was living in a $15 a week room. You
Right.
know, and it ended up being on the road for 2 years. You know, I was 24 years old. It was a very romantic beginning, you know, for me. And I really believe that's possible for everybody.
If there's a young wannabe general manager out there, what do you suggest that he do? Or
Take
she.
voice lessons.
Like you did.
I studied singing for 3 years, and I always tell people that my voice teacher made me what I am today.
If you are a young actor, what do you suggest that young person do?
Go to every audition in sight. You know, I think Betty Davis said it's 90% work and 10% talent. You've got to tread the shoe leather. You must. Just go to every audition, you know. And I started as an actor, and I thought auditions were impossible. I just didn't like being subject to someone's approval, you know. So that was one of the several reasons that acting was not the right thing for me. Plus, I didn't want it enough, you know. I think you have to want it or die, you know, I really do. And then you might make it, you know.
If you are a young wannabe director,
I would love to be a young wannabe director.
now what would you do then? What would you suggest this person do?
Ideally, find a young wannabe writer that you can believe in and join forces with, like, for example, Lanford and Marshall.
Right.
Team up with them and
Lanford
stick.
Wilson and Marshall Mason.
Yeah, team up with them and stick with them. Grow together, you know, and you'll form a point of view. You'll form an artistic philosophy, that can be meaningful, you know.
If you were a young wannabe New York theater, what would you suggest they do?
If I were a New York theater,
Yes.
raise the rent.
How would you get to be a successful young New York theater? How would you?
You mean theater company?
Theater company.
Well, if I were younger, I would go down to South Beach, okay, because I think that is a place waiting, that's a scene waiting for culture. You know, and I think that the people who live in South Beach,
They need theater.
well, no, I think they could make an exciting theater.
Ah.
You know, it would, because of the mix of the
Right.
population there. They could, you know, it could have a voice, it would be totally unique,
And Las Vegas?
and it would become national.
And
you
Las
know.
Vegas?
What do I
No.
think of Las Vegas?
Yeah, can you do that in South Las Vegas, the same kind of mix?
I went to Las Vegas once. As the plane was landing, I booked my reservation to leave. I mean, it's not my thing at all.
Albert, I hate to say it, but just when we're getting started, I have to say we have to stop here. It's been the greatest pleasure reconnecting with you today. I'm sure we will reconnect up in Cold Spring soon. Thank you, Albert Poland, and our home and studio audiences for joining us today. And we hope to see you again soon for further conversations. Thank you, Albert. It was great.